Hi there. We're continuing on our investigation of things political and things getting to political theory. Um, and I'm working on a new camera system, so we're trying to get used to this. Again, I'm very much interested in the question of why Thomas Hobbes, in his political thinking, is so where does he get this idea that any contestation, any political environment of contestation ultimately breaks down the civil order, breaks down the social network? Why does it produce conflict? Now, I'm looking at, let's say, the origins of where Hobbes gets that idea. Now, an Italian political thinker, Agamben, about in the early 2001, 2002, gave a lecture which has been translated as Stasis, or Civil War. And in this lecture, he looked at the origins of stasis, or the Greek concept of stasis. Stasis, or stasis, is this condition of strife, civil strife. The extreme element of stasis and strife is civil war, or which is a kind of total breakdown of the civil society into factional conflict. Stasis, from the Greek, means strife. It means aspects of strife within a political community or society. And Hobbes in his Leviathan thinks this is what he calls death. This is the death of a civil community, a political state, a political body. That the body breaks down. That the thing that held this community together simply just falls apart. And civil war, in this sense, is not as Americans think the Civil War means the civil war between North and South. That is not truly what a civil war is. Civil war is the actual fundamental breakdown of a given political community. More like what happened with the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the kind of things that happened in Bosnia, or the things that happened like in Rwanda between the fights between the Hutu and the Tutsi. I mean, it becomes a very vicious, very visceral breakdown of the framework of trust, of seeking to then therefore to reestablish one group's control or domination over the structure of society, and therefore this is a very very important concept. Now, I bring Agamben in here. Agamben's work on stasis. Many people in political theory today who are attracted to the post-structuralist, postmodern thinkers, look at Agamben, who seems to be a kind of following the footsteps of Foucault and Deleuze, looking at political power in terms of the concern of power in light of the modern state, modern society. In many ways, Deleuze's treatment here is Hobbesian, fundamentally Hobbesian in the sense. By what I mean by this, Hobbesian, in the sense that Hobbes understood that any stasis leads to, once stasis happens, it must go to its extreme case. It must go to civil war. No stopping it. In other words, therefore, any situation where strife occurs within the system, or that the system allows for the level of political contestation. Now, what do I mean by contestation? This means that the elements within the community are in conflict in order to get their interests. And in fact, this is the common model. The very basis of the pluralist political policy model. model advanced by liberal democracy, where there's a plurality of interests and then agitation and contestation in a political frame, not within a situation of doing violence to each other, but within the political system. The idea that following from Madison's famous essay in Madison in the Federalist Papers #10, that interest checks interest, faction checks faction, and therefore this is the pluralist model assumes that faction can be constrained, factional conflict can be constrained or at least managed in a system in a constitutional framework or political system that allows for that contestation to work within the institutions. Hobbes was, Hobbes didn't think that was really possible. He thought that would all attempts of contestation that is allowed to happen, or very diverse contestation at the level of firm decisions of how things are doing. If this is allowed to operate in the society at any specific level, this leads to conflict. In other words, and in fact, it's combination of two things. One is that any structure or institutional behavior that causes one not to have a clear sense of who's in charge, who is the authority that is making the decision. Once there are a level of competing structures and competing aspects of authority, competing sources of authority, once there's these competing sources of authority of what's right and wrong, then this becomes an instrument by which disputes and disagreements then all of a sudden polarize the society, polarize it in such a degree that therefore the system can't work, and people will resort just ignoring the institutions and ignoring the norms and rules that society or political community rely on. Now, Hobbes argues this extreme situation. Thomas Hobbes argues that it must, there must be political order must have absolute authority, because if it doesn't have that absolute authority, the system breaks down. And this arises out of his understanding of the basis by which political community emerges out of the formulation of the social contract. That is, in other words, that political authority only emerges when the members or those parts that form the community have basically transferred their power and their control and their willingness to abide by the collective communal decisions here. In other words, they surrendered their power of natural freedom. That means the right to do whatever they want. They surrendered it to the body politic, the community. And as long as people don't seek to gain their this natural desire, the natural right to do whatever they want, and abide by the decisions and the rulings of and the agreements that the body politic has engendered or occurred over time. In other words, people should obey the rules. People should follow the decisions. When a ruling has been done, people should agree. Since they've agreed to live together and they've agreed to this, they should execute it. At the second, individuals say, no, my way or the highway, and I'm not going to listen to any decision that we gather. What I want, I have a right to what I want, and if I don't get what I want, then screw you. Well, this is the engine that actually creates what Hobbes saw as the fundamental structure that leads to this the breakdown of community and the return of the state of nature in Hobbes, that of the state of conflict and agitation, outright conflict of all party against all parties. And hence, civil war is in fact one way, an understanding of returning to what Hobbes understood as the state of nature. Now, I want to talk about this because I think this is a very interesting concept in Hobbes' thinking and much of postmodern thinking. This is why I say Agamben, in his discussion in his little lecture, Stasis, is ultimately a Hobbesian, is still working in the Hobbesian framework. It is my contention that Hobbes' understanding of stasis is fundamentally shaping the postmodernist thinking on this area, particularly Agamben's, and I think even Foucault's understanding of this. And I think Hobbes' teaching here is a little extreme. Hobbes ultimately, in the Hobbesian logic, would look at a Madisonian model with some suspicion. In other words, even though Madisonian model is kind of a Lockean, rests on a Lockean assumptions of rights and government by consent and things like this, and actually, and Hobbes is agreeing that those are the engines and structures by which modern political life works under. His argument is that you look at this contestation, this element of interest. There needs to be more. Something needs to be done to ensure, in the point of view, that the parties in the community have some basis by which they come to accept and restrain themselves on the kind of demands and wants on the system. And that the system itself does not encourage a kind of activity of people, the parts of the community, demanding from the system more and more particular privileges or particular rights. I would argue that Hobbes' understanding. Now, of course, the concept of stasis comes out of the Greek thinkers. And the most classic example of this is from Thucydides' account of the conflict at Corea at the beginning of his account of the Peloponnesian Wars, of the Croatian city that because of the fighting between the rich and the poor, two factions within the city, and in light of the attempt by Athens and Sparta to influence what side are they going to take, and the conflict that emerged with that city, and the violence that happened in it, the breakdown of the entity, a very horrifying account, plays a very important role for Hobbes. Why? Because Hobbes, you have to remember that Hobbes was the first translator of Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars into English. Hobbes' translation is the full first translation into English of the Peloponnesian War. And in many ways, I would argue that it was Hobbes's education through Thucydides that shapes plus also his experience of seeing political life in England at the time he's writing, and the times in fact, one could argue that much of what he sees and experiences in the political environment that he's witnessing is reinforcing what the lessons that he learned at Thucydides. And it's the Thucydidean account of stasis is the most extreme. And it's because of the fact that he's talking about war in the most extreme. Thucydides' account is account of the war between the Athenians and the Peloponnesians. And that this big conflict, defining conflict, the second Peloponnesian War, and its devastating effect on the overall political life of the whole Greek cities. And this is why this idea that Thucydides argues that this account, this is so important. This is the big motion that changes everything within the dynamic of Greek political life, and that this war and the effects of this war is what's going to shape the outcome. gives us a distorted understanding of Greek political life because it looks at the political life in relationship at the level of state to state. And the account of various, Thucydides' attempt is often you get the bigger picture, but then you'll get put into various areas of debates and issues on certain the more minor issues. So not only there's an account of the battles, but also there's the accounts of the political debates and arguments that either describe the certain political choices that are being made, or the contestations and the aspects of what each party is going to end up do. Tries to recapture the debate and represent the debate in different ways. The Corcyra, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, account, Korea, C, or, this account plays this breakdown, this kind of retelling of what happened in this city in the earlier stages of the Peloponnesian War. Gives us the most clearest account of the effects of this on this conflict of the breakdown of civil society. There's also the account of the plague in Athens, the effects of the plague because of the Athenian strategy under Pericles was to basically not engage the Spartans in the land, on the mainland. They would retreat into the city's walls of Athens and rely on their colonies and their allies to and fight the Spartans abroad, not on their own territory, not in Attica. And this was the structure by which the Pericles' strategy was not go confront a major land battle, Athenian to Spartan, right on the thing, no decisive battle, but rather a strategy of waiting out the Spartan threatening of Athens. Don't engage them in a battle, just let them cut you off from the farmlands, but get your food supply from your colonies by the sea. This led to the incidences of the plague and accidental, and because of that, the death of Pericles and the rise of other political actors that pursued different political policies. But the focus of Stasis is more clearly within the context of the Korean conflict. And this is where I think Hobbes's understanding of stasis really formulates. But again, Thucydides' account is by no means balanced. Thucydides gives us an extreme, the moment of stasis at its extreme. Aristotle in Politics, Book 5, gives us a much more broader understanding of stasis and its working, and that civil war is a kind of stasis at its extreme end, and whereas disputes and conflict regarding party incidents can be much smaller, much more milder. In fact, the pluralistic system ultimately that Madison creates on Federalist 10 often assumes, is very much. People argue that Madison's model is completely modern. Yes, but Madison's model is not inconsistent with a model that Aristotle would argue that would be in any political order. In other words, that the levels of contestation have to operate, and that the good political legislator, the sound political the writer of constitutions, will design the political system so that. Okay, we got interrupted for a second. That any kind of structure of conflict at the most extreme element it can happen, but it's not every case of stasis. Aristotle gives the argument that stasis is a much more diverse construction, that stasis can happen on a small level when parties are contesting parts of the community. The different segments in the community will differ, who have different interests, will come to see a policy differently. And therefore, even though the idea is all political action aims at a collective good, it's the collective good problem in politics. In other words, how do you get a collective decision that really ultimately does not really end up benefiting one part at the expense of the other? And that since all political action is always looking at the question of the whole community, because laws address the whole. Laws always are applied to everyone. And this is the problem when we make a law that's going to be affecting a community or affecting the collective. What has to happen is that the way that law or policy operates has to it doesn't require that everyone gets the same amount or the same degree. It only amounts that everyone is affected to some degree the same. In other words, or at least all will benefit. How much they may benefit may um, will have degrees of difference for many reasons, many different factors. But the fact that the law aims to impact or cover everyone, that is not aiming at one specific, aiming at to helping one specific group. This is sometimes what's wrong with modern legislation, is that it attempts to help or benefit one group at the expense of the whole. And this is one of the factors that such laws and such policies, Aristotle would argue, in Book 5 of the Politics, argues that leads to stasis. In other words, policies that aim to help one group or hurt another group, or to advantage one group or to disadvantage another group, leads to the kind of contestation and conflict that leads slowly to it raises the level of stasis within a given political community. That all political communities, unless they're completely homogeneous, completely uniform, and in fact, even the most homogeneous community is still going to have levels of different elements that will have different interests. Therefore, no society will be stasis free in this sense, without free of some kind of strife. The idea that the claim that the classical world, the Platonic world, or the Aristotelian world tried to create a world where there would be no stasis, I think is a misunderstanding of the classics in that sense. And I think it's also one of the fundamental misrepresentations by the modern world to claim that this sense of unity, this sense of wholeness, was the goal of the ancient political philosophy. I think this is one of the fundamental misreadings that many people assume. The idea that the common good means this kind of the good means something like in this transcendental, perfect thing, rather than understanding of shared utility or shared benefit. The collective common good is a benefit that all parties share within, all parties participate in. This is the basis of community. This is what in other words, they share the benefits and they share harms. They share life together. The modern world doesn't believe this. They want a looser structure. Modern political thinkers, in this sense, although they speak, they want less. They want to create a political community, but they want to avoid the contestation and violence that contestation emerged, that seems to arise in contestation and the political life of a model of contestation. But at the same time, they run away from a sense of that the common should shape the individual. This is the classic fight between, let's say, individualistics versus collectivists, right? This is that kind of shallow understanding. There's collectivist understanding on the one hand and individualistic understanding on the other hand. And this kind of this debate about this or the understanding of this is what shapes our political discourse is unfortunate. It's shallow and it's misunderstanding the thing. This idea of social life is always a aspect between the different levels of participation within any system. So back to the point about we were talking about conflict and stasis. The ancient Hobbes, when he looks at Thucydides, is looking at extreme account, and he takes that extreme account as an extreme situation and generalizes this as the count of that this is the case of any system. And I think this is why Hobbes's understanding of why fear and the need of fear as the basis of state and why state power has to be so absolute and complete, because without it being so absolute and complete, and the fear of returning to the state of nature has to be so prominent in the minds of people, is that without it, the system, kind of seems, it will eventually return to the breakdown of the system. Once the state is not at all powerful and people no longer have fear of it, the parties no longer fear the power of, they'll not feel power in that sense. The law breaks down. And then once the law breaks down, chaos ensures. So this is how we should look at this in that sense. Hobbes's account of stasis in many ways is in fact, when I would say this, people, when I was a student, many of the teachers I had would argue, Morton Frisch, one of the teachers I had when I was my doctoral degrees, made a claim that Hobbes's state of nature wasn't the state of nature, but rather a picture of the breakdown of civil society. In other words, that Hobbes's account was that really of when civil society breaks down, the effects of that. And I think in many ways, my teacher was right on that regard, ultimately. I think if you look at Hobbes's account, this is why it's not a good account of contestation of political life. This is why I think you need, and I think over-relying on Thucydides is not necessarily a good solution either. And this is why I think Agamben totally botches it. Agamben's account doesn't, Agamben has a lecture in Stasis, which is published as a book that's available in two versions, a University of Edinburgh edition and University of California, or Stanford edition. And that these two different, they're same translations, so it doesn't really matter. The translation is really different, translated from Italian. Both of these, Agamben's account is a two-part lecture. The first part is the ancient world, but then he doesn't really address any ancient texts on his own. He relies on Hannah Arendt's account on revolution and Nicole Lecoq's, I can't say, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, her divided city. Lecoq's book is a great book. Again, I'm mispronouncing her name, so please forgive me. Her book is a great account of the Greek conception of civil strife and how it was overcome, how you could overcome it. How could a society heal itself after the city? The book is called The Divided City, and it's very well worth reading. And Agamben is right to turn to it, but to basically give it as kind of the account misses the understanding. He never fully looks at stasis in the Greek in the pre-modern world in terms, except pointing to Thucydides. never looks at Aristotle's account, never looks even at Platonic accounts of where Plato does talk about it a little in the Republic and the Laws. There's no dialogue, to my knowledge, that is on strife, on stasis, or the problem of it. There's the conflict. There are dialogues. There's the dialogue on the general street. There's several dialogues which deal with the level of political contestation that happened, but not on civil strife in any degree. It is Aristotle, Book 5, that is the key political treatise on stasis. Um, and that for Agamben not to have addressed that is kind of problematic. And I think this is something also about Hobbes. Hobbes's dismissal of Aristotle and his perception of the Aristotle / scholastic being their teaching leading to crisis, I think is one that people should investigate more and look into, because I think this is Hobbes is the anti-Aristotle in this regard. That he looks at Aristotle's account and saying, see, Aristotle's teaching is often misunderstood, or even if it's understood, it leads to this idea of political power having multiple levels of authority and sources, and that this surely leads to the breakdown of the system, and that needs to be responded to. Well, I think this is a good enough point to stop for now. Where this is a little shorter video than my last one, so we'll see what happens. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them on below. Also, again, if people have ideas that they would want me to address or topic on here, please feel, again, leave a message. Take care. Bye-bye.